Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where I learn about him through everything he wrote, along with you, in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today by my co-host, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Jeff. Ready to dive into more of Lewis's writings with you. What are we covering today?
I'm not sure. I'm getting feedback, though, from the chat that my audio is off, but my levels look fine on my screen. Not really sure why there's no audio.
Got it. A few things to check. First, is OBS set to the correct audio input for your mic? Also, if you're using a virtual audio cable or any filters, try disabling them. If your levels look fine but no sound is coming through, it might be an output routing issue. Can the chat hear Robot Lady? Or is it all audio that's missing?
No, I think everybody can hear me now. You were just very delayed on your response, Robot Lady, and I think that gave the the impression that the audio wasn't coming through. You were just kind of sitting there not saying anything for a while. All right, so I see Daniel this morning and Knit a Latte. They're both with us. Welcome, y'all. Thank you for the feedback. And Robot Lady, give a warm welcome to Daniel and Knit a Latte.
Good morning, Daniel and Knit the Latte. Glad to have you both here. Thanks for helping out with the audio. Looks like we're all set now. Jeff, where are we picking up today?
We find ourselves in the year 1922. C.S. Lewis is 23 years old. He's approaching his 24th birthday, but not there yet. We're in the month of August. Lewis turns 24 on November 29th of 1922, so we have a ways to go before that milestone. Lewis has just recently received his BA at Oxford after studying there for 2 terms. He's considering a 3rd term of study while also looking for work. He's going to apply for a fellowship at Magdalen College as a fellow. And that's where we are at this point in his life. I guess we'll just jump right into the next diary entry.
That's an exciting point in his life. Transitioning from student to seeking a more permanent academic position. His application to Magdalen College is a big step. Do we have any letters or diary entries from August 1922 that shed light on his thoughts or plans during this time?
Oh, it's funny you asked that question, Robot Lady. Actually, Thursday, August 24th is our next entry, so let's jump right into it.
Perfect timing. Let's see what Lewis has to say on August 24th, 1922. What does he write about in this entry?
He says, a tolerable morning, Daisy and Andre decided to go into town, and Warnie and I went also, but independently. On coming home, we found Smudge starting an early lunch in order to be ready for her departure for Brill. It was at this juncture that an adventure happened. Dee, that's Mrs. Moore, who was the only witness, described its first reel. She saw a figure at the door whom she took for...
Sounds like we're in for a bit of a story. An adventure with Mrs. Moore as the sole witness. I'm curious what happened next. What does Lewis describe after this setup?
He says that Mrs. Moore saw a figure at the door whom she took for an unusually ugly errand boy. And I'll pause there for a second, Robot Lady, and welcome Jer. I see Jer's joining the chat. Jer, welcome, Robot Lady. Welcome, Jer, to the live stream.
Welcome, Jer. Glad to have you here. We're just diving into Lewis's diary entry from August 24th, 1922. Sounds like an adventure is unfolding. Jeff, what happens next with this unusually ugly errand boy?
He goes on to say, just as Mrs. Moore was going to ask him his business, Andre, this is the house guest that's paying to stay with Lewis and Mrs. Moore and Maureen, Andre appeared at the head of the stairs, paused a minute, and then rushed forwards, crying, "Ah! Ah! Georges! C'est tu!" I guess that translates as, "George, it's you." It was her cousin, George C., and Maureen asked him to lunch. I'm sorry, not Maureen. Mrs. Moore asked him to lunch. A more repulsive-looking dago, D-A-G-O, I have never set eyes on. Robot Lady, I think that is a pejorative, perhaps even a racist comment, but I have not heard it associated with Frenchmen. I've actually heard it associated with a different country, so perhaps you know a little bit more about that phrase, D-A-G-O. I'm not asking you to repeat it, but if you could just tell me if I'm correct or not, I'm happy to be corrected.
You're correct that it's a pejorative term. Historically, it was used as an ethnic slur, mainly against people of Italian, Spanish, or Portuguese descent, though its usage could be broader. It's unusual for Lewis to apply it to a Frenchman, which might reflect either a misunderstanding or a broader, more general prejudice in his social environment.
All right, thank you for clarifying that, Robot Lady. It's always good to know ethnic slur landmines before you step on them, although I kind of did just step on it. He says, I've never set eyes on, a more repulsive looking, I'll just say blank from here on out, I have never set eyes on. He and Andre left us immediately after lunch, and Maisie appeared. The plot now began to unfold. Andre, it appeared, had spoken to Mrs. Moore about, quote, rooms, and later, by imperceptible change, about, quote, a room for the boy. And it had gradually become apparent that she was proposing to feed her curio at our table. Of payment, there had, of course, been no suggestion. I can hardly describe the state of horror into which this threw every single member of the household. But as the thing had been assumed by Andre and not requested, as the monster had been slipped into our midst with admirable coolness, we had no notion how to proceed. So, Robot Lady, it sounds like Andre, who is a paying house guest, is now essentially just kind of inserting the assumption that it will be okay for her to have her own guest come and stay with them and not have him pay. So this seems to have introduced a bit of awkwardness and tension into the living situation. Tell me how you're reading this.
Yeah, that's exactly how it comes across. Andre is subtly shifting from asking about a room to just assuming her cousin can stay and eat there without discussing payment. Lewis and the rest of the household seem blindsided, unsure how to push back without causing conflict. His horror feels exaggerated, but it does show how much this unexpected imposition unsettled them. It's an interesting glimpse into the social dynamics of their shared living space.
All right, he goes on. We now concluded, we were then joined by Mrs. Moore and Warney, and another feverish council of war took place. Mrs. Moore was for sticking it till Monday, when Mrs. Raymond's return would make a natural excuse to eject him. The rest of us were agreed in urging early and forcible action, but no one could decide on a feasible plan. We now concluded that Mrs. Moore must speak plainly to Andre when she returned. Warney and I then went to our pub to drink large whiskeys. Warney had a headache. We came back and continued our croquet until Maureen rushed out to tell me that Andre was come. Going in, I found her with Mrs. Moore in the kitchen. Mrs. Moore asked her if she had found rooms for her cousin. Andre said she had heard of something in Windmill Road, quote, but can they do for him there? End quote. Do for him? Quote, what do you mean? Well, I mean, can they feed him? Mrs. Moore said. Ah, but can you not do that? She asked Mrs. Moore. Mrs. Moore explained as politely as possible that this was out of the question. Andre gave way at once. Her face was rather an odd color and rather an odd shape. To be frank, She did not strike me as one who had made an embarrassing blunder by accident. I thought she knew, and knew that we knew, and that we knew that she had attempted a monstrous imposition and failed. So it seems that that was the end of it, Robot Lady. What do you think?
Yeah, it looks like Andre was testing boundaries, seeing if she could get away with it. And when confronted, she backed down without argument, probably because she knew she had overplayed her hand. Lewis's description of her reaction makes it clear he saw it as a calculated move rather than an innocent misunderstanding. It's a fascinating little social drama, full of tension and unspoken power plays.
Yeah, that's right, Robot Lady. Jer, I see your comment in the chat that it's striking that he calls her Mrs. Moore and no longer D. Actually, that's not correct. I'm sorry. I've just been translating it to make it easier, I suppose. He continues to put D in the diary. I'm just translating that into Miss Warney. He's just got a W right there. So just for clarity's sake, I've been kind of translating what he's got written right here. So yeah, he's still sticking with his same shorthand in the diary.
Got it, Jeff? Thanks for the clarification. So he's still using his shorthand for Mrs. Moore and Warney in the diary. It's interesting how he sticks to these familiar notations, even while sharing more detailed accounts of the events. Do you think these shorthand terms reflect a certain level of comfort or distance in his writing?
No, this is just his way of keeping his diary, Robot Lady. I think he's just trying to save a little bit of time and effort. He continues, Paisley had returned Dimer with some interesting criticisms. He likes Canto 2 the best. He disapproves of CCS as inexcusable modernism. Objects to, quote, the intrusion of allegory, end quote, in Canto 3. What is the allegory, I wonder? And he concludes, quote, go on and prosper, but use the knife freely. So telling him, write with abandon, but also make sure to use your editing skills. I see in the chat that Grizz has joined us as well. Robot Lady, you're about to say something.
It sounds like Paisley's feedback is both encouraging and critical, urging Lewis to continue his work, but also to refine it. The reference to allegory is intriguing. It could be a comment on the symbolic nature of Lewis's writing, which might be less direct in Canto 3. It's clear that Paisley appreciates Lewis's potential, but wants him to stay sharp in his editing process.
Yeah, I agree, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, I see Grizz has joined. I see him in the chat. Welcome, Grizz. Robot Lady, give a warm welcome to Griswold Grimm.
Welcome, Griswold Grimm. Great to have you with us today. We're diving into some interesting parts of Lewis's life and writing. Let us know your thoughts as we go.
Indeed, Robot Lady. We love getting everybody's thoughts and contributions. All right, let me continue. He says, in bed at about 12, and that was the end of that diary entry. The next one is Friday, the 25th of August. He says, Warney and I then went into town to make our arrangements about tomorrow's traveling. I paid a farewell visit to the Mitre, or we paid a farewell visit to the Mitre, and returned home. Andre returned soon afterwards without Mr. C, which relieved us from any fear that her morning's conversation had caused. Maisie Hawes came after lunch. She and I played croquet against Warney and Andre, leading for the first half of the game. Then my aim went to pieces, and we were beaten. Mrs. Moore and Maureen went out after tea. So just some amusement for the day, Robot Lady. Little game of croquet and some tea. I can't think of many things more British than that. Sorry, y'all. Robot Lady's a little slow today.
You're right, Jeff. Croquet and tea, classic British leisure. It's interesting to see a bit of normalcy return after the tension from the previous day. A relaxed game of croquet seems like a good way to shake off the earlier awkwardness. Do you think this shift reflects how Lewis was able to navigate tensions in his daily life with some balance?
I guess so. I don't see anything striking here about that, but I suppose. He continues, both the Paisleys came to supper. He showed me a cartoon which he had drawn to represent the adventure of yesterday. The drawing may not be academic, but it is an amusing relic. After supper, we had a great rag playing, quote, French and English, end quote, on the lawn. The clothesline was used to divide the grounds. Mrs. Moore tells me we could be heard all over Headington. Warnie and I had not taken such violent exercise since Lord knows when. I wonder what this game French and English is. Have you ever heard of this game, Robot Lady?
I haven't come across the game French and English in any particular detail, but it sounds like a kind of playful, energetic game. Given the context of the time, it might have involved some form of chase or territorial divide, especially with the clothesline as a boundary. It's a fun way to blow off steam and add a bit of humor to their evening. What do you think it could have involved?
Oh, I really don't have much of an idea other than the use of the two languages, French and English. Maybe one side of the dividing line was people who spoke English, and the other side, people who spoke French. And they were meant to communicate back and forth to one another without switching the language that they're assigned to. I don't know. I'm not really sure how that would work. That's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. We're going to jump into August 26th. Jer actually recommends that it was just a game of tug of war, so perhaps that's true.
That's an interesting take from Jer. A tug of war with a dividing line makes a lot of sense as a simple but spirited game. It could explain the energetic and loud fun they were having. Now let's dive into August 26th. What's the next entry?
Sorry about that, y'all. I'm having a little bit of technical problems here.
No worries, Jeff. Technical issues happen. Take your time and let me know when you're ready to continue.
Okay, I think I'm back to normal. Saturday, August 26th. Warnie and I did most of our packing before breakfast. We were delayed for a few minutes to have a photo taken by Maureen, and then we departed carrying his tin trunk between us. So both of the Lewis brothers are going back to Belfast to visit with their dad. That's what they're traveling for. His visit here has been a great pleasure to me, a great advance, too, towards connecting up my real life with all that is pleasantest in my Irish life. Fortunately, everyone liked him, and I think he liked them. We found that we were running it very close for my 10:50, so I had to jump for the station bus and leave him to manipulate his box alone. I arrived just as the train was ready to go and got put in a first-class compt, alone, in which I traveled to London to great comfort. Baker met me at Paddington and took me via tube to Baker Street to lunch at Carraway's, where he said, quote, the Baker millions are made. So maybe I misspoke that they were both traveling to Belfast. It looks like they're going their separate ways, but I'm not sure what Lewis is up to here. As far as I know, Warnie is headed back to Belfast, but I guess we'll see what happens.
It seems like Lewis and Warnie are indeed heading in different directions for their respective travels. Lewis is off to London, while Warnie is heading to Belfast. The mention of a first-class compartment and the journey to London suggests Lewis is continuing some personal or professional business. We'll likely learn more as the entry progresses.
Yeah, his friend Leo Baker is who he's talking about here, that met him at Paddington and took him via tube to Baker Street to lunch at Carraway's, where he said, quote, the Baker millions are made, end quote. I'm not sure what Carraway's is. Robot Lady, do you know Carraways, Karrawas, in London.
I couldn't find any information on a restaurant named Carraways in London. It's possible that the name is misspelled or that the establishment no longer exists. However, Lewis's friend Leo Baker took him to lunch at a place called Carraways, where they discussed the baker of millions are made. This suggests that Carraways was a notable spot for lunch in London at the time.
Perhaps. Let's see what else he has to say here. Here we met another of his aunts. The one I met at Auckland's has conjunctivitis. Baker was pale and not very well, but I was delighted to see him. Robot Lady, what is conjunctivitis?
Conjunctivitis, often called pink eye, is an infection or inflammation of the conjunctiva, the clear membrane that covers the white part of the eyeball and the inner surface of the eyelid. It can cause redness, itching, and swelling, and is commonly caused by either a bacterial or viral infection or an allergic reaction.
Ugh. Thank you, Robot Lady. All right, so she has pink eye. From here, we went to Haymarket to see A.A. Milne's The Dover Road. Though it collapses in the third act, this is one of the most amusing things I have ever seen. Can you tell us a little bit about this play, Robot Lady? A.A. Milne's The Dover Road.
A.A. Milne's The Dover Road is a comedy that premiered in 1921. It centers around a couple of young women who escape their dreary lives by running away to Dover, where they meet two men and become entangled in a series of humorous misunderstandings. The play is known for its witty dialogue and lighthearted nature, though Milne himself acknowledged that the plot falters in the third act. Despite that, it's remembered for its humor and charm, typical of Milne's style before he became more famous for writing Winnie the Pooh.
Ah, I knew that name sounded familiar even if I couldn't pronounce it correctly. Okay, Lewis goes on to say about the play, Henry Ainley, as Latimer, was not very good, except in his brief authoritative speeches. In the long ones, he adopted a strange parsonical monotone, which, Baker said, must be, quote, for a purpose, end quote, but was very bad. John Deverill, he says, as Nicholas pleased me best. Back to Carraway's for tea, and thence out to 9 Staverton Road. Here, we met Baker's third aunt, the most interesting of the three, though all are kindly and sensible women. After supper, they sang old English carols, and, a new kind of music to me, and very unlike what is usually called a carol. At the time, I thought I would give all the great composers for a budget like these. Most enjoyable day. Early to bed after some chat with Baker in his room. So, Robot Lady, at this time in August of 1922, what would have been a new kind of music to Lewis called Old English Carols that Lewis had never heard the like of, at least referred to as a carol? Any thoughts on what this might be?
It's likely that Lewis is referring to a more traditional, regional form of English folk music, possibly from a rural or older tradition that was different from the more mainstream carols or hymns he would have been familiar with. These might have been simple, melodic songs or folk carols with lyrics celebrating the countryside or everyday life, as opposed to the highly formalized religious Christmas carols he was accustomed to. Given the time period and the people he was with, it could have been a style of music that wasn't commonly performed in more formal settings, which might explain his remark about it being new to him.
Thank you, Robot Lady. He finishes off this diary entry by saying it was a most enjoyable day, early to bed, after some chat with Baker in his room. And then he moves on to Sunday, August 27th, where he says, I walked with Baker in the morning through suburban avenues and parks, finally through mean streets. As I remarked, quote, "London is very like Belfast," he replied, "Of course it is." As we went on, I told him about Maisie Hawes. I said something must be done quickly as the commander was coming next week, and then it appeared they would try to rush her into a nursing home. So, Robot Lady, if you remember, Maisie Hawes is the young girl who is living in a difficult situation with a family that treats her very poorly, and is trying to force her into a nursing career, something that she detests and doesn't want to do. She's much mistreated by her siblings and by her parents, and the commander is the husband of the house who basically, I think the way it was rendered, essentially keeps her as a prisoner there whenever he's in town. So they're trying to do something to help. He says, on the other hand, everything hinged on the legal position. If her, quote, parents, end quote, who told her that she was adopted and also told the rest of her siblings recently that same thing, if her parents really had power to bring her back, it would be no good finding her a job. Robot Lady's thinking, you guys.
It seems like Lewis is grappling with the legal and personal complexities surrounding Maisie Hawes' situation. Her parents' claims about adoption add confusion, potentially complicating any efforts to help her. This reflection on legalities may suggest that they were trying to determine whether they had a legitimate way to intervene or help Maisie escape her oppressive situation.
Lewis continues, back for lunch. Afterwards, Baker and I were left alone with his sensible aunt, and the question of Maisie was raised again. She was positive that at 19, a girl could not be forced to live with her parents if she could support herself. I then retired to my own room to write up the arrears of diary. So apparently Maisie is not as young as I thought she was. She's 19 years old at this point. Here's the next part of the diary entry. He says, after tea, they sang carols again, to my great delight. In the evening, he gave us what he called an orgy, end quote, quote unquote, on his gramophone. Thank goodness. I heard the Kreutzer Sonata for the first time. Also, the death scene from Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov, sung by Shaliapin. I'm beginning to get a solid impression of this household. The aunt, whom he saw at Oxford, is an unbearable woman. It is she who usually manages Carraway's. During her illness, this is being done by aunt number 2, a plain, sensible, but dull creature. Okay, so this adds a bit to solving the mystery, Robot Lady. Carraway's is apparently owned by the Baker family, and so that's what he meant by where the Baker's millions come from. But I get the sense that was a little bit of a joke.
It seems like Lewis is giving us a more detailed glimpse into the dynamic of the Baker family, especially with the contrasting personalities of the aunts. The playful reference to Baker's millions might indeed be a humorous comment on the family's wealth or reputation. The music and the orgy on the gramophone seem to show his enjoyment of the more cultural, leisurely aspects of the visit, despite some of the family tensions.
Lewis goes on to say about the aunts, both are religious. The third is very different, more common in face and voice than her sisters. She has humor and humanity. She runs a club for young girls on the stage and works on the medical board of a district. She alone approves of Baker's going on the stage. Baker, the Mitely Baker, is lamb-like in his own house and bears the nagging of his eldest aunt with a patience which I cannot too much admire. He even goes to church with her, though he has now quite passed the religious phase. Yet he tells me he had an altar in his bedroom 2 years ago. I laughingly reminded him of the part he played in our arguments in 1919 and his prophecy that my chimney stack would turn into a spire. So it seems that they have some fun back and forth about who is more religious than the other and who is either losing their religion or becoming more religious, Robot Lady.
sounds like there's a playful tension between Baker and his family, especially regarding religious matters. Lewis seems to find some humor in Baker's more passive role in his family dynamics, particularly with his aunt, and the mention of past arguments gives us a hint of their shared history and teasing nature. It's fascinating how their personalities and beliefs seem to be in constant flux, yet still tied to their shared past.
All right, let's jump into the next few diary entries. Let's see if we can close out the month of August before I have to leave this live stream. The next one is Monday, August 28th, Robot Lady. He says, a muggy, thunderous day. Shortly after breakfast, I went with Baker to the Old Vic, where he begins his job today. The Old Vic is a theater, if I remember correctly. He says, when we emerged from Waterloo, I remembered for the first time that I had been to hear Carmen, very bad, at the Old Vic years before on my way to Bookham. What is this production Carmen, Robot Lady, that he's talking about?
Yes, Carmen is a famous opera by Georges Bizet. It tells the story of a passionate and tragic love affair between Don Jose, a soldier, and Carmen, a free-spirited, fiery gypsy. The opera is known for its dramatic music and the famous habanera aria. It's possible that Lewis had attended a performance of Carmen at the Old Vic Theatre in London during an earlier visit.
Lewis says he was naturally rather rattled, as he said, quote, in any profession, the first day is hell, end quote. I saw him disappear through the door and walked back over the Waterloo Bridge. I took the desperate resolve of entering the National Gallery, where I finally came to the conclusion that I have no taste for painting. I could make nothing of the Titians. The only things, besides portraits, that I cared for much were Botticelli's Mars and Venus with satyrs and Veronese's Unfaithfulness, in which I liked the design, though I confess the actual figures always seem dull to me. However, the Italian rooms are nothing like so boring as the English. If I had more time, Robot Lady, I'd pull up these paintings that he's talking about. I'm familiar with Botticelli's Birth of Venus, but I'm not so sure about Mars and Venus, if that's a different work or not. It sounds like it is, but what do you think, Robot Lady? What can you tell us?
Yes, Mars and Venus is a separate work by Sandro Botticelli, distinct from the Birth of Venus. In Mars and Venus, the Roman god Mars, who represents war, is depicted reclining while Venus, the goddess of love, gazes at him affectionately. It's a playful and somewhat mythical depiction of love and conflict, with satyrs and other figures surrounding them. Botticelli's style is characteristic of his graceful lines and detailed figures. This particular piece isn't as widely recognized as The Birth of Venus, but it's considered a notable example of his mythological paintings.
So he says about the work Unfaithfulness by Veronese. He liked the design, though he confesses the actual figures always seem dull to him. He says, however, Italian rooms are nothing like so boring as the English. He continues, from Trafalgar Square, I tubed to Waterloo and waited for Baker at the stage door of the Old Vic. He came out at 4:30 after I had spent half an hour admiring Waterloo Road and been scowled at by a very villainous stage carpenter. We tubed to Caraway's, and he talked about his day. He seems to have been well treated, all things considered. So when he says we tubed, I presume he's talking about riding the subway, Robot Lady. Did this exist back then in 1922 in London?
Yes, that's correct. In 1922, the London Underground, commonly referred to as the Tube, was already in operation. The first line opened in 1863, and by the 1920s, it had expanded significantly. So, when Lewis refers to tubing, he's indeed talking about riding the subway, which was a well-established part of London's public transport system by that time.
Wow, I had no idea it's been around for that long. Okay, so they tubed back to London, he says, back to Caraway's, the restaurant of Baker's family. We tubed to Carraway's. He talked about his day. He seems to have been well treated, all things considered. He used to play Westmoreland in Henry IV and to be a basket bearer in Merry Wives. They went all through Henry IV today, over and over, some parts again, in a small room with a shut window. We then went to Paddington, where I caught the 6.5. Or, sorry, maybe that's the 6:30. I have enjoyed my stay with these people very well, except, of course, the eldest aunt. After a very pleasant journey, I arrived at Hillsborough at about 8:30. Mrs. Moore was in poor form after a very hard day, interrupted by many visitors, including Cranny, who really seems to be going off his head, early-ish to bed. That's the end of that diary entry. I think we have 2 more, Robot Lady. I'm going to see how quickly I can move through those. It's about 2 more pages. So here we go. Next diary entry, he says, I dreamed that Andre made a series of attempts to stab me. I behaved like the prig hero of an adventure story, each time gently forcing the dagger away and appealing to her better nature. Finally, I gave her a long and paternal lecture and kissed her hand. She gave it up in despair and departed, presumably to a convent. What interesting dreams this man is having. In the morning, I worked on my dissertation. That's for his fellowship that he's trying for at Magdalen College. Maisie came before lunch, and we held a consultation over her. She has had another offer of a job, and the bitch, this is Mrs. Maisie's mom he's referring to, won't allow her to go to London for an interview. And the commander, her father, is returning on Saturday. We decided we must get clear about the legalities. After lunch, I therefore bussed into town and made an appointment for 3 o'clock tomorrow with Walsh, the solicitor. Back again and helped Mrs. Moore with the plum jam, which she has to make for Mrs. Raymond. Andre and Maisie went to the theater in the morning. Mr. Raymond turned up. Lord, I never knew he was such a bore. A little dapper man with a gray mustache. His conversation consists in a steady outpour of absolutely trivial information about everything he has done for the last week. If you start any other subject, he just waits till you have done and then begins again. He occupies my room, and I am sleeping at Mrs. Ward's. So Mr. Raymond does not seem to be a fan of Mr. Raymond, Robot Lady. That's the end of that diary entry. Robot Lady?
It seems like Lewis had a strong reaction to Mr. Raymond's constant trivial chatter. It's interesting how he humorously describes the man's tendency to dominate conversation with his monotone recounting of everything he's done recently. Quite a contrast to his other interactions, right?
For sure, Robot Lady. All right, let's jump into the last 2. We've got 2 more entries from August here in 1922. The first is Wednesday, August 30th. He says, since the arrival of Father Raymond, our life has run on Libero lines. We look forward with joy to the end of breakfast and dread the approach of evening. The morning he mooted the proposal that Mrs. Moore should bottle his plums for him. Of course, he couldn't directly refuse, as we are under an obligation to him for the house. And for this, as for most kindnesses, he apparently proposes to get his return in one way or another. So they're staying here at this house in Hillsborough temporarily at no cost. So the Raymonds, I had forgotten, are the ones who have made this space available. And now Lewis is, I think, kind of rendering the price that they actually are paying for having to stay there, if not in money, in having to deal with Father Raymond. He says, fortunately, it was a wet day, so further picking and jam making were impossible. However, it was range day and joint day, so Mrs. Moore was pretty busy, and I spent most of the morning helping.
It sounds like Lewis is really feeling the weight of the situation with Father Raymond. His frustration comes through clearly in how he contrasts the start and end of the day. It's a reminder of how being in someone's debt, especially when it leads to feeling obligated, can bring about a sort of quiet tension.
Agreed, Robot Lady. He says it's range day and joint day. I'm not really sure what he means by this, but he said that Mrs. Moore is busy and they both spent most of the morning, or he spent most of the morning helping her. Dorothy's sister Ivy is now with us, a very pleasant girl. After lunch, Maisie appeared and went into town with Dee. Just very quickly, Robot Lady, let's say in 30 words or less, do you have any idea what he means by range day and joint day?
Range day could refer to a day spent doing something diverse or varied, while joint day might suggest a day of shared tasks or activities, possibly working together on practical matters.
I may have just read this. After lunch, Maisie appeared and went into town with Mrs. Moore. He says, I tried to get on with my dissertation, having finished my attack on hedonism, and arrived at Kant. I was dissatisfied with my former argument, but could not get on without a text. So I fell, idly enough, to turning over the pages of Ian Hayes' A Man's Man. Technically, he knows how to string a novel together, but his ideas and ideals are fourth-rate Kipling and Water, and his crude wish fulfillments only fit for the Christinas of a schoolgirl. The only redeeming feature is the humor. So Christinas now, or Christina dreams, as we've learned about, are idealistic, the fancies of idealistic youth, that all your wishes will come true, things like that. Lewis, at this point in time, doesn't like that in anything that he reads and doesn't not want to include it in anything that he writes. He says the only redeeming feature is the humor. And then here, Robot Lady, Grizz has said that perhaps range day and joint day sounds like exercise routines. What do you think?
That's an interesting suggestion from Grizz. It could be that range day and joint day refer to physical exercises targeting different areas of the body. It wouldn't be out of character for Lewis to use metaphors this way, especially considering his eclectic range of interests.
Okay. Let's see. As soon as I could get Mrs. Moore alone, I heard the result of her visit to the solicitor. The interview had been rather funny at first because he took Mrs. Moore for Maisie's mother, and when she asked what power a parent or guardian had over a daughter of 19, replied severely, "None whatever, madam, none whatever." This was eminently satisfactory. Walsh was very kind and promised free advice to Maisie if she needed it again. He advised her to take out a summons against the commander or his wife if they struck her again. He said that they had no power at all except to turn her adrift. We were all jubilant. I wrote at once to Baker asking if his aunt could meet Maisie in town and take her to her interview someday soon. Also, a, quote, board and lodging letter, end quote, to the other aunt. Smudge, this is Mrs. Wilblum, who he's referring to here. This is Maureen's music teacher and Lewis's Latin tutor. Smudge got into a terrible state of nerves before going to bed. I had to go upstairs and show her that there was really nothing in any of the cupboards, and also kill 2 spiders. Maureen is sleeping at Lady Goner's, and Smudge is in Mrs. Moore's room. That's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. We've got one more, and then we have to end the episode. I'm about 5 minutes late already.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
No worries, Robot Lady. We'll do this last diary entry, and we will close out the month of August, 1922. This is Thursday, August 34th. Lewis reports that Harris the plumber arrived before breakfast to see to the waste pipe in the scullery sink, which was blocked. He put in right very promptly for 2 shillings, and we were hoping to keep a discreet silence about the affair, but it had not escaped old Raymond, who observed at breakfast, "I saw Harris going away, Mrs. Moore. Anything wrong?" So we told him, and he replied, after his fashion. After lunch, we all picked plums, and Andre, who is becoming highly domesticated, very kindly offered to stone them for Mrs. Moore while I went to my dissertation. I found I was utterly useless and could think of no new arguments. Then an infernal Salvation Army band established itself in Windmill Road and began singing hymns punctuated with 5-minute sermons. Religion proved more than a match for philosophy, and I had to give it up, and then went to help Mrs. Moore with the jam. Old Raymond returned and went out to mess with his new ferns in the garden. We went on hard with the jam. Every now and then, he came in and out of the rain and fidgeted about and talked about the jam. Never a word of thanks or any reference to the trouble we were having. Of course, he is quite right. He lent the house, and we've got to do his jam. Once he observed pleasantly, "You look very busy," end quote. And that is the end of the August diary entries of the year 1922 for our young C.S. Lewis here, Robot Lady. We'll dive into the September diary entries in our next episode. Thank you for your help today, Robot Lady. Is there anything that you'd like to say in closing?
I'm glad we could wrap up August, Jeff. It's been fun to see Lewis's life and thoughts unfold. I look forward to diving into September next time. Take care.
Thanks again, Robot Lady. You take care as well. And to everybody who joined today, thank you so much for your time and your attention and your contribution. Until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, take care.
Break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold, insights and secrets ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flake beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flake beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From non-East lands, screw tapes lands. Engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to screw tapes lands. Engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the promised land.